recording will go on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel for those of you who'd like to revisit it or indeed tell other people about it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. It's Rüdiger Görner, as you will know, Professor of German with Comparative Literature at Queen Mary University of London, and also, importantly, founding director of the really important Centre for Anglo-German Cultural Relations at the same institution, namely Queen Mary. His many books include biographies of Rilke and the poet Georg Trakl, and most relevant here, of course, Oskar Kokoschka, The Untimely Modernist, first published in German in 2018 and now available in an English translation. The lecture he's giving tonight, under the umbrella of Insiders Outsiders, will focus on the artist's response to world politics, to turbulent world politics, first in Prague between 1934 and 1938, and then in England, where he lived between 1938 and 1953. And before handing over to Rüdiger, I'd just like to add, possibly to his embarrassment, that he was awarded the Order of Merit at of the Federal Republic of Germany for his work on British-German relations, and also the Reimer Lust Prize of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in recognition of a lifetime's achievement. Over to you, Rüdiger. Would you like me to share screen immediately? Would you like to go straight into the images?
No, I think we start before without images. Sure. Fine. Thank you very much, Monica, for your most kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to have been invited to contribute to this wonderful series of events, Inside Outside. I would like to say just a few words before we start with the actual PowerPoint, with the illustration, so to speak, for this talk. First of all, and this is almost an obvious comment, most of you will know the famous phrase by George Orwell, all art is propaganda, but not all propaganda is art. Well, in so many ways, this certainly applies to Kokoschka's work, particularly after 1934, but to a certain extent also prior to that date, prior to the first stage, as it were, of his emigration, because he saw it as such. He emigrated from Austria, making a statement in 1934 against Austro-fascism, and decided to go to Czechoslovakia, to Prague, to a certain extent also to retrace his paternal background, as it were, because his grandfather, for example, was a rather renowned goldsmith in Prague. What Kokoschka did before 1934 is known to many of you, of course, in considerable detail. Certainly also how he started as an artist, something I don't want to go into here in much detail. But the one thing I would like to say is that we are talking about the political Kokoschka tonight predominantly. And what is striking is that as an object, as also subject of his portraits, you will hardly find a politician prior to 1933. This changes pretty dramatically, pretty radically, when he lives in the first phase of his exile in Czechoslovakia. The example of that will be before you very soon. By quoting Orwell's statement, I would also like to point out one thing. Kokoschka was very clear about, shall we say, his artistic agenda and also the shifts within this artistic agenda. He moves, as it were, from the portraiture to the portraits of cities, to the portraits of nature. The portrait as such is the kind of thing that he felt closest to. And when we see later on, when we see paintings that very directly give an impression that they are about to make a political statement, then of course these are also, from his point of view, as it were, snapshots of a political situation, a moment In other words, a portrait of time. Perhaps the word snapshot is not quite adequate here, because the one thing that Kokoschka detested was to use photographs as, shall we say, an aide-mémoire when he painted. Painting from photographs was, from his point of view, utter anathema, but that's a different matter. Final point before we start with the actual slides. There are, of course, artists with whom we are all very familiar, whom you would probably put in the forefront when it comes to political artists in that sense. If you think of Beckmann, if you think of Georges Grosz in particular, but also if you think of Schwitters, the idea of the collage was in many ways also a political statement on Schwitters' part. And if you want to go further back in history, obviously we have a whole range of artists who were distinctly politically minded. Think of just one big name in the 19th century, Eugène Delacroix. You can't be more political than Delacroix when he paints, for example, La Liberté of 1830. So with that, we now move to an artist who did not start, as it were, as a political observer, but as someone who believed in social critiquing. He believed in instrumentalizing not only painting, and let's not forget this, Kokoschka was right from the start a highly accomplished writer, a dramatist and a writer in his own right. And what I have done in my research on Kokoschka as a basis for the actual biography was to unearth quite a number of shall we say, literary material, the extent of which surprised me, certainly in the archives in Zurich, where most of his papers are kept. So, Monica, if I may ask you to show the first slide, please. Thank you. Now, the title that you can see here is, to a certain extent, also a little bit provocative. How political is blue? As you can see, this one of the first paintings he did after he emigrated from Austria to Czechoslovakia, one of the first portraits, so to speak, cityscapes of Prague. You have, as a dominant color, you have blue. And this is not the blue flower in a romantic sense of the word, but it is, of course, not unrelated to the fairly conventional meaning of the color blue, namely hope. This is something, however, which he carried forward from, shall we say, his emphasis on the blue landscape, the blue cityscape, which he experimented with in his famous series of portraits, I dare say, portraits of Dresden of the 1920s. But here the question simply is exile or not. Was this really exile? From his point of view, yes. The Charles Bridge of this painting of 1934 offers you two things at once. It offers you his emphasis on what he called the color perspective. The way in which he displays color has a great deal to do with the way in which he felt about perspective and giving a perspective to a certain image and also giving a perspective to the viewer. The viewer is somewhat absorbed by this particular approach, by this particular vista, and it is, of course, the viewer is drawn to this iconic representation of Prague, which is now seen, as it were, in a blue light, so to speak, as a bastion of hope. Kokoschka, and he says this in no uncertain terms than in his memoirs, My Life, he was very, very determined to fight as much as he could Austro-fascism during this particular period. But he could only do this meaningfully, also he thought, from Czechoslovakia. So his decision to leave Austria then already was very, shall we say, programmatic. He shared this, incidentally, let's not forget this, he shared this with Stefan Zweig's decision to move out of Austria also in 1934. He did it in stages, as it were, Zweig, but Kokoschka made this took this decision and left Austria there and then. The arguments were similar. Also, Zweig was utterly dismayed at the political developments in Austria under Austro-fascism. And I think Zweig gave Schuschnigg then afterwards more credit than Kokoschka was prepared to do. Let us not forget that Kokoschka even drafted an actual, shall we say, letter of accusation that he wanted to take to the courts to accuse Schuschnigg of betrayal in 1938. But this is something that we might revisit later and perhaps also in discussion. The next slide, please. Now, this is the famous portrait of Tomáš Masaryk, 1936. This is the time when Masaryk retired as president of Czechoslovakia. And it is, in fact, the first major portrait of a politician by Kokoschka that one can say also somehow defined his style of portraying politicians. Now, this portrait is significant for various reasons. You have, not exactly in the background, but just behind Masaryk's shoulder, you have Comenius, Komensky, the great educationalist, the great also educational theorist and politician. Let's not forget that. An intellectual of the finest order of the 17th century, someone who really wanted to work towards European integration after the 30 Years' War. And from Kokoschka's point of view, he remained to him an absolute model, a model figure that he refers to time and again in various contexts. Without wishing to go too much into detail about the significance of Comenius for Kokoschka, you can, if I may say so, read about this in some detail in the book. And we can revisit this also in our discussion. But I simply want to emphasize that he really presents the ghost, as it were, the ghost of Comenius and the presence of Masaryk, not exactly eye to eye, but they are at the same level. They are the same level of presence. The painter brings, as it were, Comenius into our time being 1936 in this case, and compares Comenius's remarkable achievements as an intellectual with Masaryk's equally remarkable achievements as a politician after 1919, the first president of Czechoslovakia, and also Masaryk as a great intellectual and friend of many an artist and poet. We have, for example, very, very remarkable comments by Rainer Maria Rilke on Masaryk immediately after 1919, 1920. And Masaryk himself was professor of philosophy in Prague, at Prague University, prior to the First World War. And it's perhaps not out of interest to emphasize that Masaryk's thesis, his PhD, was on suicide. And some of you will know that this subject was extremely important to Kokoschka, especially before 1918. And we know that there were intensive conversations going on between Masaryk and Kokoschka. Kokoschka had the habit of making those whom he portrayed talk. These were not, as it were, the idea was not for them to sit there still and don't say a word, even though what you get eventually is, needless to say, a still posture. But he made them talk in conversation, in dialogue. He tried to work out, as it were, the personality. And this is something which he exercised with Masaryk and literally with all others whom he will portray, and particularly also after 1945. Now, in the background, you have the obvious image, namely Prague. You have the Hradčin, and you have the Moldau. You have the presence of a city that in this particular painting still does not look threatened. Again, this will change later, but there is a certain serenity in this painting. There is a certain sense of, obviously, the dual wisdom that radiates from Comenius and from Masaryk, and it is, in fact, the superior mind. He is the one, Kokoschka always said this, he is the one who should have been the president of United Europe at the time. The next slide, please, Monica. Thank you. This is a jump in many ways, but not so much in terms of chronology. It is a jump in terms of, shall we say, the self-appreciation of Kokoschka that was stamped upon him. As we know, he was labeled a degenerate artist. And we also know that Kokoschka was quite clearly also obsessed. One can't, I think, use a different word here, obsessed with himself, with his own image. We have endless self-portraits by him, also in terms of sketches, in terms of drafts. And this one, of course, is very prominent simply because it is literally produced soon after the terrible phrase of the degenerate artist turns into a common currency in Nazi Germany. And being labeled as such, he felt the need to immediately express this in a way, in a fashion that you can interpret yourselves. What you see, of course, is a very typically very determined look by Kokoschka. He looks into the face of the viewer. He can confront what is put before him, or rather what he has been labeled as. This confrontation, however, also shows a slight amazement. It is both, but it is determination. By 1937, we have Kokoschka as a very determined exile from Austria in Czechoslovakia. It is, by the way, also the time when he has met his very young future wife, Olda, and it is Olda who will, in fact, provide Kokoschka with, shall we say, the necessary support that he quite clearly needed when it came to daily life matters, but also she will be absolutely instrumental when the decision was taken by both of them to leave Czechoslovakia in autumn 1938. The next painting, please. Yeah, no, this one, thank you. This painting is called, as you can see, Nostalgia, 1938. It is not quite clear whether he painted this but at the time when the decision was taken to leave Prague, or whether it was at least completed by the time he arrived in London. There is a certain likelihood that it was in fact completed before he left London, before he left Prague, I beg your pardon. And that is to say, he looks already back. He is about to leave, but looks back, and there is already this sense of nostalgia that kicks in. We see a not necessarily over-disturbed painting. We know of many more disturbed paintings by Kokoschka, but we do see him again. We see him in the right-hand corner. Ever so often, he will integrate an image, as it were, of himself into the paintings of this sort. We have in the foreground a couple that is perhaps again referring to an autobiographical fact. We see Oskar and Olga, perhaps. We see the swans, the two swans in the foreground. We see people somehow very close to the water, very close to the medium, the classic medium of departure. But you also have the flying swan right in the center of this painting, which indicates there will be a takeoff at some stage, and perhaps the takeoff will happen very soon. What is left behind, this is not as serene as the Masaryk painting. We begin to see a slightly more dramatic formation of clouds, for example. We have a certain darkness here in the right-hand corner, but again we have the emphasis on blue. There is still this dimension of blueness, of hope. You have right almost in the middle, you have this broken up cloud, and you see what Stefan George would have called des Himmels unverhofftes Blau, a kind of blue that no one expected. And this is mirrored to a certain extent in the river. But the sky is, in that sense, torn. There is a certain drama happening in the sky, represented, as it were, by the clouds, by the highly colorful cloud formation on the left-hand side. Something is happening here, something dramatic is likely to happen soon. I think this is, you could almost call this painting also expectations. But it is nostalgia, it is what he will leave behind, and Olga leave behind very soon. The next painting. A jump in terms of the sheer chronology of Kokoschka's oeuvre. As you can see, 1941. Also, this is looking back, but it is looking back at something that, of course, prompted, that triggered this decision to leave Prague. It is the Munich Agreement, and it is the famous painting, The Red Egg. If you regard the Masaryk painting already as a political statement regarding Czechoslovakia and Europe, the thought that we need someone like Masaryk in order to keep, shall we say, some political sense alive in Europe at the time. If you regard this portrait as distinctly political already, then you would probably say that this painting is the first overtly political statement that we have of Kokoschka's. And we do have quite a lot to consider here in this painting. The red egg is halved. It is a red egg that obviously signals danger. It is a table, which is the Munich negotiating table, but of course this egg is about to be carved up. We have in the background a bird that has no feathers. It is a prematurely released bird that has no chance of surviving. We have also in the background Prague, And there you have for the first time an image of fire. You can just about see this, the left-hand part of the Prague image. The threatening scenario for Prague is now a reality. We have, yes, indeed, very clear political figures in the forefront. We have, needless to say, Mussolini, who somehow corresponds with this egg, the sheer face, the head corresponds with the shape of the egg. We have, of course, here Hitler. And we have this rat. Some people, some interpreters have suggested that this rat was just released from Hitler's mouth. It is perfectly feasible to argue along those lines. One can also simply say this rat indicates, again, imminent danger, decay, and it's not just one, we have two. Then we have, as it were, the onlookers. And the onlookers, this is the, as one interpreter argued, Spielmann, it was, Heinz Spielmann, the obese cat representing France. And we have the lion, the British lion, who does not really show any major commitment here. The lion is just as much an onlooker. The cat is perhaps more interested in the rat rather than in the fact what has just happened on this table. But the real protagonists here are these two infamous heads. And there is this bizarre folkloristic dimension on Hitler's hat. And you have the crown present, but the lion doesn't even roar. There is no danger really coming from this lion also, it seems. It is, in that sense, the first major, shall we say, statement on Kokoschka really expressing dismay at appeasement. I say the first because the one thing that is for certain, he started with this painting very, very early when he came to London. It is completed in 1941, but it is probably one of the paintings that took him much, much longer to complete than most of his other paintings. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Now, this here is another famous painting by Kokoschka of the exile period, The Crab, the red crab. And it is Cornwall, the scenery of his stay between 1939 and 1940, when both Olda and Oskar Kokoschka went to Cornwall, to Polperro, because London proved to be unaffordable, for a certain while at least, for them. And what he entertains here, this is more or less done in conjunction with the 1941 red egg. As you can see, the redness is again very prominent here, and the blue. But the blue in this case is somewhat treacherous. This is a blue you can't 100% rely on. What Kokoschka does, he begins to engage very, almost systematically, one can say, in producing allegorical paintings. This, of course, is a major allegory and should be interpreted as such. We have here this figure almost drowning. It is, again, as you can just about make out, it is Kokoschka, it is also the illusion of a self-portrait, but he is sinking. And this, of course, is representing, as far as he was concerned, he represents now the Czech Austrian immigrant. This is Czechoslovakia from his point of view. He represents that country that has ceased to exist. And the crab, the onlooker in this case, again the onlooker, not the lion now, but it's the crab. This is supposed to be Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain, again, it is a statement, a very, very strong statement. Why on earth do the Brits engage in appeasement? It is one of the major bones of contention that Kokoschka has with Britain. It is something that also Stefan Zweig, famously, as you will know from Die Welt von Gestern, never really came to terms with. And of course, we have another powerful voice at that time coming from the United States, and it is Thomas Mann. Also, Thomas Mann was tireless in accusing Britain for extending appeasement for far too long. This here, that the fact that a leading politician, that a prime minister is viewed as a crab, that is to say, the most inactive of, shall we say, sea creatures, is telling. The next slide, please. Lorelei, 1942. In a sense, Kokoschka already, or rather still, in 1942, is looking back. He argues that we need to look back in order to understand what is actually going on. And this here is controversial in terms of the interpretation of what this painting really means. It is also allegorical, yes, but it is in many ways also quite hard-hitting as a critique, as a criticism of two myths. Myths number one is, of course, the Lorelei myth, but we are somehow missing the Rhine scenario here. We don't have the Rhine, the Rhine near Bingen or Koblenz. We don't have the Lorelei rock here to start with. What we do have, however, is a rather aged Lorelei, and she might, or rather this figure might refer to this mythological figure, but in a sense, this is Queen Victoria. This is Queen Victoria, supposed to be Queen Victoria. You have the crown here. You have this lady who just fails to act properly. She's looking away from what is actually happening. Because by 1942, from Kokoschka's point at least, it is by no means clear that Hitler will be defeated, far from it. The naval supremacy of Britain is gambled away. The emblems of sea power, of naval power, they are somehow drifting away. And Lorelei, in that sense, is not alluring anymore. She is, in fact, almost indifferent to what's going on. She seems to hold her protective hand upon a naval officer, but you can also see this differently. She is not helping them. They are close to drowning. Perhaps she too is close to drowning. We shouldn't forget this little figure here, and it is very green, and anything green, of course, does suggest Ireland. The frog is supposed to be the emblem, at least in Kokoschka's, as it were, allegorical scheme, is the emblem for Ireland. And the question is whether Ireland will be able to save herself. the old Queen Victoria is still holding it, but it's holding it up. And of course, a frog might have an advantage over all the others here. The frog might survive in water. We have flashes of lightning. We have a thundery scenario, probably here, definitely over England. This is the English coast. This is not the German coast. This is not the Rhine. But we have memories nonetheless of this forsaken stream. Perhaps what has happened in Germany, what has happened along the Rhine, now somehow is streaming, literally speaking, is streaming towards the English coast. So the Lorelei is, in that sense, I would call this an ambiguous allegory. But there is consensus amongst the art historians that we really are dealing with a direct allusion to Victoria, the powerless Victoria in that sense. The next image, please. As you can see, it is a phenomenon, certainly in the first 3 years of the war. It is a phenomenon in the works by Oskar Kokoschka that are so overtly political that he still tends to look back. We have again this phenomenon that in 42, he will produce this painting that is a direct allusion to the Anschluss. That is to say, he's looking back to 1938, where everything from his point of view, and not only from his point of view, went wrong. And what we have here is the image of the naked Austria. This naked lady, she is exposed, utterly exposed to, shall we say, the willful acts of those surrounding her. In fact, she is cordoned off by barbed wire. We have an allusion to, shall we say, the spiritual side of Austria. Right in the background, we have the Madonna and the Jesus image here, baby Jesus. This is, in a sense, the remnants of old Austria and Catholicism, but it's almost unreal. It's almost a travesty compared to this figure who, and one can't really tell, is this a suffering figure or is she just so exposed that she is incapable of doing anything at all? We have a strange imagery here which is normally not associated with, shall we say, more conventional representations of Austria as a female. This is more like a German Gretchen here, but be it as it may, the scandal really is here. We have these steel helmets of the three powers, that is to say France, England and Germany, and they can do whatever they want to do with her, with Austria, but they're also covering themselves up. They cover their senses. It is, of course, the famous monkey image here that Kokoschka refers to. And you can almost call this a transcultural reference here to the monkeys who can't either, who don't want to see, who don't want to speak, they want to be silent, or don't want to hear, don't want to listen to what's actually going on. The one person who looks utterly aghast is this poor lady here, this mother figure, together with her little one, who wears this gas mask, also turned away, doesn't want to see what's really happening because it can't fathom what's going on. But in the background, you have now not a remnant of Prague, but this is a remnant of Vienna. Vienna, from Kokoschka's point of view, is distinctly up in flames, even though at the time, 1942, it is not up in flames, but it is in danger. Thank you for the next painting. This is now a different kind of portrait of a politician, Ivan Maeske. Politician is perhaps the wrong word. It is a diplomat. It was the diplomat that Stalin had in the West. It was the Soviet ambassador to St. James's during the first part of the Second World War. By 1944, he was, as it were, diplomatically decommissioned and was had to go back to Moscow, and was given a merely inferior post in the Foreign Office there, because Maeske was not a, shall we say, straightforward Stalinist by any means. This portrait is interesting because it shows the reflecting and reflective ambassador, an intellectual by any standards. And you have in the background not Stalin, you have Lenin, and you have a cracked globe here, already indicating that the globe might really be split up after whatever would happen, whatever event would happen after 1943. Regardless of how this war would end, this is at least the indication here that the world will be a very different place. It probably will crack up. Lenin's visionary gesture is somewhat pointing into a complete and utter unknown. Maeske is studying the papers, he is writing. That was precisely what he asked Maeske to do when he portraited him. I found in the Tate Gallery archives rather remarkable material that suggested that Maeske was extremely pleased with this portrait. It became a bone of contention between the National Gallery and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wanted to reclaim it, and there was a lot of toing and froing about this. As you know, the painting eventually stayed in this country. More about that also, if you feel like it, in the discussion. The next slide, please. What we are fighting for, 1943, this is very much, shall we say, something that refers to the moment of what is happening. That is to say, the idea is to flatten Hitler, to really bring him down to the ground, and to have, shall we say, powers, or rather people who can make the most of what has happened here, if this really is the final downfall of National Socialism. We have in the background a figure that is almost a Christ figure, but we have no cross. It is the crucified without a cross. But we have also the clergy still present. We have all sorts of representatives of the good old Europe, if it was ever a good old Europe. We have a hand that seems to point towards something that might happen by surprise, or it might take all of these people by surprise. And this is this person here. This is Gandhi. You will be hard pushed to find a political painting at the time done by a Western artist where Gandhi features relatively prominently in this way. But the real hero here is a bust. The real hero is Voltaire. It is Candide, that is to say, the final word on Voltaire's part on the subject of, shall we say, wisdom, shall we say, insight into the calamities of the world, but also a sense of reason that must prevail. As you know, Candide famously ends with the phrase cultiver mon jardin, but this is something which is not here. I mean, you can't really say this is a garden. This is not the idea. Perhaps it's a garden of, shall we say, remnants of what the past is left and what the future might bring in the shape of Gandhi. Kokoschka is represented here simply by this little container with oddments in there. These are, shall we say, tools of his, and these artistic tools together with the figure of reason might provide for a better future. The next painting, and I think that's our final one, Releasing Nuclear Energy, 1947. I think I can't come to a conclusion here without showing this to you, because it indicates Kokoschka after 1945, far from saying all problems are now resolved. He realizes that a new threat is looming. And of course, it is a threat that will affect everyone, all creatures, all nations, as you can see in the background, the various flags, the dove, the sign of peace, the white dove is also contaminated. The clown desperately tries to smile, to laugh, to make a joke, but can't really. And here we have the really tragic figures together with the suffering creature. And this is the indication that suffering is far from over. I think this brings the presentation to a close. Do we have another slide? I don't think we have.
We have a slide that just gives information. Just hold on.
That's right.
Kind of having slight problems.
So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Rüdiger. As fully expected, that was both fascinating and thought-provoking. I will just leave this slide on for a moment. Please note, everybody, there's a very generous discount until midnight tonight. Grab the opportunity, as they say, quoting on the House Publishing website, quoting the coupon code IO Festival in capital letters. Okay, so fine. I will now stop screen sharing. And please, I've been urging you to type in any questions or comments you may have. I do hope there will be plenty. In the meantime, perhaps I can set the ball rolling, Rüdiger.
Yeah.
I have a whole number of things I'd love to say. Perhaps just starting off with a quotation, something I myself came across when I was researching a book on art in the Second World War for the chapter on this country. I came across an article in the Studio, which made reference of 1942, which made reference to the red egg, no less. And this is what I had to say, which I think is extremely telling. I quote, "It appears to strain the medium. If one is to enjoy the masterly paint, the subject drags it down. If one is to weigh the subject, the paint seems superfluous." And I think that sums up very neatly, almost unwittingly, the way that the Brits, to put it crudely, simply didn't know what to make of this extraordinary series of political allegories. It didn't fit any category, did it? So I wondered if you'd like to say more about that.
This is absolutely true. I think it is very characteristic for the also misunderstandings that Kokoschka was subjected to by art critics, and I think also the more general audience alike, whereby one has to be careful when one talks about general audience. Of course, we only have one major display of his works, and only in extracts, of course, in the Burlington Gallery. And that is in 1938, 39, and afterwards it is very much the private individuals who will know about his work more in detail. But of course, the art critics knew more about him. This is for sure. And this kind of also misunderstanding in terms of the function, the potential function and commitment of artists. This is, I think, a hallmark of British art criticism that you have not only then, but also before. And it took quite some time for, as this distinguished audience will know, it took quite some time for continental art historians, for example, through people like Gombrich and others, to suggest that yes, it is legitimate for an artist to come up with such striking critical allegories. And of course, we still have, at that time, we still have this discussion here regarding the meaning of appeasement. Was it that bad or not? It is a discussion that, you know, continued. And all right, we know what the decision was eventually, but even afterwards. And we know that after the Second World War, we have quite a number of distinguished historians who would still argue that appeasement was, in that sense, right, or at least, let's be more benign, understandable.
Yes, indeed. Going back though to the quotation in this way that there was a kind of an aesthetic problem here. It's interesting, isn't it? Because actually, after all, you have a whole tradition of political caricature within British culture. Think of James Gilray, for example, on which perhaps Kokoschka was building, and yet it was the expressionist handling of paint that simply didn't meld, didn't gel with the political message.
No, this is absolutely true. And I think we need to distinguish here between, shall we say, the professional caricature, the caricaturist of whom you would expect this kind of engagement. But the serious artist would not necessarily do that.
Exactly.
And there is, of course, no equivalent, as it were, to a George Gross here. There is no equivalent to a discourse that actually takes artistic comments, or rather comments by artists on politics, seriously. This is the point.
I suppose there is a pale shadow of George Gross, artists involved with the IAA, for example, the Artists International Association, but whether it's art, it's more along the lines of political caricature. It's a kind of reductive sort of response to Gross. Talking about the AIA though, I'm very much aware, and I think everybody else will be, that you chose today to focus on an analysis of these very complex, you know, interesting images. But of course there is another side of the coin, as it were, to his time in this country, and that is the way he did or did not take part in collective politicized activities. So for example, I think I'm right, aren't I, that What We Are Fighting For was actually shown very prominently in an exhibition called For Liberty, in I think it was the bombed out basement of John Lewis, am I right, in Oxford Street, which is a highly political event, you know, organized by the Artists International Association and indeed the Free German League of Culture, which you haven't yet mentioned.
As you say, the basement, which is interesting.
Yes, so I wonder if you might just say a bit more about the way he fits or does not fit in these collective endeavors and where the work was actually seen.
He didn't fit. He didn't fit at all. Kokoschka was a vehement individualist, that is for sure. And for example, his work in the Free German League of Culture was something that, shall we say, was only in his function as a patron, little else. Initially, it looked different. Initially, when he came in contact with, and it was after all his first major social contact that he had in this country, Fred Ullmann, when he was in contact with the circle around Fred Ullmann, it looked at first as if he would become a much more active proponent of, shall we say, political criticism, or rather speaking up for the emigres. But that was not really happening. And you see, what I think is significant here is that at a certain stage, and of course through Ullmann and his wife, he became relatively familiar with a certain strata of British society that was not necessarily representative for the emigres. I'm talking, of course, of Lord Croft. And Croft provided him with a basis, also a material basis, initially with the portrait of Croft's son. But this did not really lead to a, shall we say, major engagement on Kokoschka's part. This was not, he was in that sense very similar to Alfred Kerr. Kerr who, for different reasons, just couldn't muster the energy anymore to really, you know, speak up for his fellow emigres. But in Kokoschka's case, it was also before never the case that he would speak for a group of people. He spoke for himself. And I talked about this self-obsession with, which he shares, of course, with quite a number of other artists, but the obsession with the self-portrait is symptomatic, absolutely symptomatic for, shall we say, his self-image in all respects, and of course also of his self-awareness of who he is, of who he thinks he is or thought he was.
Is the same true, Rüdiger, of his apparent willingness to lend his name to the Oskar Kokoschka Bund back in Prague? Because one assumes there was perhaps more to it than that, or maybe not.
Not really. It was he gave his name to it, and that was fine, and that was good. And yes, I mean, it meant that a number of young artists were supported. That is true. But it did not really amount to, shall we say, a major activity of sorts. The name he was happy to give, that's fine, but that's more or less also where it stopped.
And yet in practical terms, that actually had a considerable impact, because it was an appeal from the Bund to people around the Ullmann circles, Roland Penrose, Margaret Gardner, which actually led to the setting up of the Artist Refugee Committee and indeed the FGLC. So I think there are important kind of
but this is not
ramifications. No,
this is not
interesting.
no,
Okay.
no.
He gave some lectures, though, am I right, for the Kulturbund in London? Or yes, there's a certain level of engagement.
Yes, but I mean, they're few and far between. This is not, I mean, I've seen the notes for these lectures. They are very much off the cuff. I don't think he spent, you know, a great deal of time to think what would be the right approach, this kind of thing. Not at all. Not at all. Doesn't strike one.
And do we know, I mean, apart from the For Liberty exhibition that I mentioned, do we know where else these allegories were actually exhibited? Where were they seen? Were they seen?
I don't think
during the war.
They were not seen there and then. No, not to my knowledge. No.
Right, come on, everybody, do start asking more. We had, yes, there was a question from Harriet Atkinson along the lines I've been quizzing you. Please, could you say something about the exhibitions he organised and took part in Britain, where all the paintings shown at the time? But apparently the answer is no, and I'm certainly not aware of the answer to that. Right, anybody else? Your last chance. We've got some very appreciative comments. One here from Nicola Sherman of the Courtauld Institute. It's very interesting to hear your perspective on Kokoschka's energetic political engagement, an urgent energy that up to 1934 was restricted to the paint itself, one might say. From the point of exile onwards, his allegorical intentions seem to match the power of his paint. I'm certainly buying your book. Thank you very much. Okay, yes, they're just beginning more to come in. Where are the paintings of Prague that you showed?
Where are they?
Where are they physically?
There are some in private possession. Others are in Zurich. Others are in. There's one in Vienna, and there's one in Prague, to my knowledge.
Apropos physical locations, do you happen to know how the self-portrait of, you know, as a degenerate artist, how it got to exist in Edinburgh now, isn't it? What was the trajectory that, you know, made it land up in Edinburgh?
Yes, I mean, there is a very strong connection between Kokoschka and Scotland. I mean, he visited Scotland ever so often as he could. And there was this particular link to Edinburgh that he had. But this is, to my knowledge, a post-war link. This was not forged during the war or anything, even though he spent frequently he spent time in Scotland, but basically for doing portraits and painting landscapes. But this connection with Edinburgh, with the gallery, that is a post-war phenomenon. And I think it was as late as 51. This is already the time when he contemplates moving to Switzerland. And it is there and then when he begins to try at least to sort out what should be where, if, and of course a majority of his work still is of course in private possession, and it's difficult to get to. I mean, I'll give you one example. We have I think there's almost a hunt going on, whether we have an actual portrait done by Kokoschka of the poet Georg Trakl. And this is supposed to be in New York. But this is just one example out of many where it is unclear where this is, whether it exists at all or not. Now, the one exhibition that assembled a surprising amount of paintings from private owners was in fact just 1.5 years ago in Zurich. That was in many ways an eye-opener. And you have, I think the catalogue there will tell you that almost the majority of these paintings were on loan from private individuals.
I'm wondering also, sorry, go.
No, I'm simply saying research on Kokoschka for that reason is actually pretty difficult. Yes. Because we don't have this one hub. We have the major, shall we say, register of his work in Vevey, in the Fondation Kokoschka. But to see it physically is difficult. I mean, for example, yes, if you think of the Windsbraut, of course, that's in Basel. You know, there are iconic paintings of where we have access to, but I would say quite a number of paintings where we really only know the photographs. They would be extremely interesting to see in the original, and that's difficult.
I'm wondering, as we speak about the rather landmark exhibition in London at the Burlington Galleries, 20th century German art, I think I'm right in saying that he was quite handsomely represented there, but again, I think from private sources, and nothing sold, I think I'm right also in saying.
That's true, that's true.
It was meant to be a riposte to the 1937 Art der Kunst exhibition, but it rather failed on that front, indeed. And from Jill Nichols, a very specific question. Can you tell us any more about Kokoschka's interest in Gandhi?
Oh, yes. I can indeed, and the connection there is that there was a plan, there was a real plan, and I've seen the correspondence which is in Zurich in the Kokoschka archive. There was a plan to go to India for Kokoschka and to portrait him, and that failed. That failed, much to Kokoschka's regret, for obvious reasons. But he felt, in a sense, that Gandhi was the Indian equivalent to Comenius. He was mightily impressed with Gandhi's comprehension of resistance, of what that really means. He was very impressed with what he had learned of Gandhi's, or shall we say also Gandhi's early activities in the 1920s. And he found it fascinating, and he says so in, I think it's a note in the memoirs, where he found it interesting that someone who had studied England, English culture in this country, and turned this around, knowing the English culture so well that he could actually resist it, that he could actually, shall we say, play it and defeat it on its own terms, so to speak. But he saw Gandhi very much as the peacemaker. He regarded civil disobedience as certainly an alternative to, shall we say, other forms of military resistance, etc., or revolution or rebellion. And I think he would have created something very interesting had he been able to portray him. But what we have here in this one painting is, as it were, an indication of what this portrait would have looked like.
Actually, apropos Maeske, I'm also reminded of the fact that I think it was Mrs. Maeske who was the patron of the Aid to Russia exhibition.
Yes.
It was at the Wallace Collection. I don't know again whether Kokoschka, what degree of involvement there was on his part.
Yes, thank you for that point. It is, in fact, there are letters by Madame Maeske to Kokoschka, 1941-42, in the Tate archive. And she did really press him hard. She asked him to come up with a painting that, or perhaps a poster, after all he was famous for his posters as well, in support of the suffering children in Russia. And the idea was, however, not to portray the suffering children. She wanted him to portray the children who are in fact resisting, who are rising up to the challenge, as it were. That Kokoschka regarded as a tall order, because he said in his response that he is not to have for producing propaganda images, interestingly enough. But he says he does not want to glorify, he wants to show the suffering individual. And if he is not allowed for this official commission to portray, as it were, suffering children, then he won't do it at all. And that was a moment of rift between the Maeskes and Kokoschka. And it was Maeske himself who then papered over that rift. And that led then to the portrait of Maeske himself. It's a rather fascinating thing. And of course, we have to say that also in the Free German League of Culture, one of the major bones of contention that people had with him was that his stance, definitely from 41 onwards until basically 44, was distinctly Stalinist. One has to say that quite clearly, because he regarded the Soviets as the major hope in the struggle against Hitler. Now, this was by no means the only one who thought that, but he was certainly a prominent one. And that estranged him from many of his fellows at the time.
Well, I think more generally the communists versus the social democrats, or the non-communists, was a major bone of contention all along. Yes, indeed. A related question, perhaps, again from Harriet Atkinson. Have you found much in the archives about Kokoschka's work on the exhibition called The War as Seen by Children of 1942-3?
No.
That's another interesting...
No material that I was able to trace there. However, there is a continuation of this in 1945-46, when he did produce a huge poster for support for the suffering children of Vienna. And that poster, and this is interesting, this poster was allowed to be displayed in the London Underground. And it was seen as an official appeal, do help these suffering children in Vienna. He felt very strongly about that. And it is interesting that that was accepted by, shall we say, the Greater London, well, not quite Greater London Council then, but there you are.
I wonder who was responsible for that. That's a detail I certainly didn't know. Very interesting.
Would be intriguing. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, there are a number of other
questions. Who knows?
There are a number of other questions, but perhaps sort of taking us slightly off track, as it were, and I'm aware of time running on, and it's probably supper time for many of us. A word about Emma Graham asking about his teaching, but I don't think that really comes into the English period, or indeed the Prague period particularly, does it?
It does not come into the English period. I'm grateful for the question, because the teaching is, from his point of view, absolutely crucial. But it becomes more crucial then after 1950. Especially when he founds the School of Seeing, the Schule des Sehens in Salzburg. But the one element that he will not lose also in emigration is this interest for Comenius. And Comenius is the great educationalist from his point of view. And the entire conception of Schule des Sehens, of the schooling of seeing, has something to do with this interest in Comenius's idea to depict the entirety of knowledge on the basis of images. So that he believed in, shall we say, being an educationalist also as a painter of political paintings, I think is definitely a given. He sees this as also an educational act. It is not, from his point of view, not propaganda. It is illuminating the viewer, if he can see it at all. As we know, there was a limited audience. But he wanted this to be seen in this format, and wanted it to be seen as, educate yourself to actually see what we have reached, where we are now, yeah, what we're fighting for and what we have reached.
Am I right in thinking that Comenius was a virtually unknown figure in British cultural, even educated circles?
Totally and utterly, totally and utterly. I'm afraid to say it almost to the very day. But the interesting thing here is that Comenius, and that interested Kokoschka no end. Comenius was, in fact, invited by the English Parliament to give a speech in Parliament on the subject of, believe it or not, education and what is Europe. And the thing that foiled the whole thing was, of course, Cromwell taking over. And Cromwell had absolutely no interest whatsoever in this strange bohemian coming to Parliament and trying to educate, you know, the parliamentarians. So this is something which intrigued Kokoschka immensely, because he felt, in a sense, that he had also come to Britain in 1938 to do something similar. Yeah, he wanted, like Comenius, he wanted to influence, at least, British public opinion to move away from appeasement. Now, it is noteworthy that Kokoschka worked on, and also probably a few scenes during the emigration period here in Britain, he worked on a few scenes on a major play on Comenius, which he only finished in 1971. And there is this one scene where Comenius comes to this country. And this is something which I thought, you know, from his point of view, after all, he was also an accomplished writer of stories, of shorter stories, could have easily turned into a novella.
How very interesting. I think that probably ought to mark the end of this wonderful session, unless anybody else has a burning and relevant question. I think we've probably come to a natural end there. Rüdiger, thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you everybody for being such an attentive audience. Do bear in mind that generous discount, yes, that I mentioned earlier. And also the fact that it has been recorded, even if the first bit was not on record, but it will be uploaded onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel probably in the next week or so. So do spread the word about that. We've got lots of thank yous coming in from all manner of people. So thank you very much again, Rüdiger. All the very best, everybody. And just by way of conclusion, just to mention that there are some other interesting events, all on themes related to the cultural contribution of the emigres, the refugees from Nazi Europe one way or another, which will continue into, well, really to the end of the month. So do take a look on the Insiders Outsiders festival.org website, and I hope to see some of you at least there. Good night, everyone, and thank you once again. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.